Now, he didn't have any broken bones, and he didn't have any clothing on his body. The coroner stated he died of hypothermia. He was located 20 miles from where a hiker had last seen him, in an area that he could have easily walked to any road in the surrounding area of the mountains. Now, Jacob was raised in those mountains and in the desert. If it starts getting cold at altitude, it's a no-brainer. You walk downhill in elevation into the desert. The coroner never released a date and a time of death, which was important, and he was found 2 air miles from a road. Yet we are led to believe that he fell down a mountain uninjured and laid there to die. There's an old saying that a New York detective made one time, and it's perfect for this, and that is local reports for local consumption. They write something like this, hoping that the public buys into it and it's forgotten, because none of this makes any sense.
Yes, and we're also distracted with our lives that unless this is someone you know personally, you usually don't ask questions. You shrug your shoulders, say, that's weird, and move on. And that's exactly what they're hoping for. I would hope that your work has inspired people to maybe ask further follow-up questions or dig a bit deeper or challenge some of these reports.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people do, and I'm sure that the parents are just extremely distraught at what happened, and, it's horrible. But when you get into the minutia of the details and you think about it logically, this doesn't make sense.
Correct. And another thing I noticed just scanning the Land, Air, and Water book is that you also note with the profile points that a lot of these people are German. We talked about this last time, that there seems to be a couple of genetic markers, but in this most recent book, it's still there. Is this something that I guess is still in the mix, that a large percentage of these people are German, or are there other nationalities now, a few years later, that you're also finding spikes in?
For some reason, Germans just stick out on this. In my past books, I've written about a series of disappearances of highly intellectual people, namely physicists. And the physicists that are missing are all German. Why is that?
It is odd. It reminds me of a story I had been told on this show a long time ago about a leprechaun encounter. This guy sees this weird little man, and he's like, "What are you?" And this leprechaun says, "Well, I'm a leprechaun, and the only reason you can see me is you must be Irish." Turns out the guy does have a strong genetic heritage to Ireland, although this was somewhere else, maybe in the States or something. And he's like, only people who we have a connection to can see us. And we talked about cloaking earlier. Maybe there is this weird thing that only certain nationalities, certain genetic areas, certain hotbeds can see certain paranormal entities. It's like we don't really have anything else in our world that would be a parallel to that, but it does seem to be in the mix.
Yeah. And, you talk about leprechauns. On Native American reservations, the Native Americans see little people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because these people are 100% convinced they saw what they did.
Right. And in the Jacob Biedler case we just talked about, I have the detail here that I don't think the sheriff was willing to release files to you when you try to investigate further. Is that right?
That's correct.
How's that going? I mean, since your work has exploded in popularity, have you had more or less instances of resistance from park systems or government agencies overall in collecting data and trying to follow up on some of these things?
It's a mixed bag. There's been several people that used to work for these organizations that have talked to me now and tried to explain how tough it is being on the inside and trying to work within the confines of those organizations. A lot of them have said, hey, don't be frustrated. It's hard on us as well. Other people have said, we don't understand it. But most of the consistency is that if it's a location where there's mandatory disclosure, I usually get it. If it's option, it's sometimes 50-50. And if there's no rules to govern disclosure, I usually don't even ever get it. And sometimes I've used other people to get information from me when I know that a specific organization won't want to release it.
Right. I would think you'd have fans out there that would kind of be working in these fields and then they would want to share things with you, but I'm sure it works both ways. I've also heard that it seems like as you file more freedom of information requests, they're messing with you and throwing up some roadblocks there too, right?
Oh, that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I guess you're charged at a different rate because you're a published author or some kind of weird categorization like that?
Oh, they lay a label on you as a commercial requester. And so now instead of charging you at like $25 an hour, they charge you at like $125 an hour.
Oh.
And every way they can think of to obstruct you in getting the information. I asked the National Park Service to get me a list of missing people from their system. And I said, because I was a published author, I can ask for this. And they came back like 6 weeks later and said, well, we did some search and we've determined that your books aren't in enough libraries. And there's nothing in the Freedom of Information Act about that. It just says if you're a published author. So they made that up. And then I said, well, let's just do this. How about if I just pay for it? You go out and you get me the list of missing people. I'll fund it. They came back 6 weeks later, $1.4 million.
Wow. Wow.
So they don't want anyone to have that list.
No. And they're digging deep for excuses if you're going to invoke the libraries. I mean, in the internet world, libraries are not really on anybody's radar anymore.
No, pretty archaic.
Yeah, they should ask if your book is on the internet or in bookstores, which clearly it is. So, yeah, that's just a strange thing. And I guess I would ask, with these people who have talked to you, it's got to be pretty remarkable that you have people that probably have some insight, but yet they want to remain maybe anonymous. And I guess you could classify them as whistleblowers, at least to you. But have they indicated that this is just bureaucracy getting in the way, just unorganization, or have they stated anything more nefarious that makes you suggest that they do have a handle on this and they just want it to go away?
You know, I don't think we've gone up high enough on the food chain to really figure out what is happening at the upper echelons of the National Park Service, because the rangers and things at the lower level, most of them don't even know what's going on, and they're not decision makers. There was a parent I talked to on a missing child in the South, and he told me at the time I spoke to him that he didn't believe that the superintendent of the national park where their child disappeared had any control or any decision-making authority whatsoever, and thought that Washington, D.C. was pulling all the strings on everything. And he goes, every time I asked this guy anything, he said it'd take me a day to get an answer and he'd have to go call someone. He was in charge of one of the biggest parks in the U.S., so hard to say what is really going on.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Native Americans, and I also was thinking, because I'm sure you've had everything suggested to you at this point, but when it comes to trying to understand the landscape of North America, it seems like the best source for information would be Native American legends or mythology. Have you found any overlap with places that they say do not go in their lore and then these disappearances?
I'll start off with an easy one. I totally agree with that thinking. One of my best friends is a Native American chief, a Cheyenne Arapaho, and he's a 50-year law enforcement man. His name is Harvey Pratt. Very wise, very smart. And I use him in a lot of the work I do because he gives me a lot of insight into things. Now, one of the most famous places in the western U.S. that Native Americans said never to go to is Crater Lake. That was an area that the tribes in the Klamath area thought was bad, had bad mojo. It was called Mount Mazama before it exploded. And then since then, they still believe that that area is not a good area. And there have been so many people who have disappeared from the greater Crater Lake area, it's ridiculous. And it's one of the only areas where there is several missing boys that were never found in that region.
Mm. And since the last time we talked, I've actually been to Crater Lake, and I definitely had a lot of this stuff in mind. My wife and I, alone, we walked from the top of the crater all the way down so we could touch the water at the bottom and then walked back. And the whole time I was definitely thinking about this kind of stuff. But what's also interesting about the Crater Lake area is you can't access it without going through a gate and paying the guy at the booth. So it's like, this area is highly controlled. What is going on in here? Because the only roads in and out have these booths there, and it's a national park people are paying to get into. So if someone goes missing, I mean, what are we paying for if you're not patrolling this area, keeping this area safe? It's not like you're just out in the woods.
No, and Crater Lake is one of those historical areas where I've written about people disappearing over 100 years ago under very, very weird circumstances. Again, it's not an incident or that's happening just today. It's historical. It was happening decades ago. And I guess the national park, I'll defend them at one level and say, they have a huge, huge area to patrol. And they can't keep an eye on everybody everywhere. But I do think that they have a responsibility to tell people that, national parks can be dangerous. This isn't Disneyland. There's predators out there. Keep a close eye on your child. You'll never go into a national park and find a board where there's photos of all the missing people there. You won't find that. And why is that? Why don't they want people to know who's missing in that park?
Right. And in terms of things that tie into the Native Americans, going back to the film, you have one hot spot that is the Crazy Mountains. I mean, what an odd name for mountains, but the legend goes that the Crow Indians had put a curse on this particular mountain range. And when you extrapolate that out, I could understand a lot of Native American tribes putting a lot of curses on a lot of areas of this country at that time. Maybe this is karma to some degree.
Who knows? Definitely could be, but Caucasian people just really treated the Native Americans horribly when we were moving west. So if they put a curse on us, we probably deserved it.
Right. But again, this also extends outside of the United States.
Oh, yeah, for sure. No, the First Nations people of Canada have the same issues that Native Americans in the U.S. have.
Right. And the Aborigines of Australia and New Zealand, where some of these cases are too. Seems like we haven't treated very many people well.
No, exactly.
And when you have, I guess, a lot of enemies, it makes the mystery even more broad. I mean, who could want to harm people?
And unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to even know about it, and they don't want to read about it, and some people don't want to even hear about it from friends. So it makes it hard to get this message out by way of books and even movies sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when I think about the films, I mean, they are impressive in their quality, which is something, I'm critical of in the alternative, conspiracy, paranormal spaces. There's a lot of low quality productions out there, and I just got to hand it to you that these films are so well done. Were these both crowdsourced?
No. The first movie was a Kickstarter and raised, I think, $150,000 on that one. And we were able to do a pretty good job. This last one, we just wanted to do it ourselves, and we did. And Mike DeGrazier is the director. He was a co-director on the first one as well. After you do a couple of them, you kind of figure out what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. And in this latest movie, I'm kind of front and center in it where I wasn't in the first one. In this movie, as you know, we really went to law enforcement, spoke to a lot of those individuals who had direct contact, and tried to get their feelings on screen as to what was happening. And I think we were successful at that. And then we went to the locations and showed the people what they look like at great expense to us sometimes. And I think it was important. And then on top of that, we used graphics from some really high-end graphics people to show what the layout was, what the topography was like, the trek that the people took, and then even use them to show some of the unusual aspects of what the hunters had seen in the woods.
Yes, I definitely love it. And especially this most recent film, it just really put in my head the idea that there is something hunting people, because it's picking off the weak ones. It's picking off people on the edges of the group. And maybe it's something highly intelligent that realizes that it doesn't have to go out into the cities to feed if people just keep filing into its environment. But it doesn't explain why we don't know what it is. We know what bears are. We know what mountain lions are. There's no struggle. But a lot of indications do speak to, if you were hunting, which one would you grab? And that seems to be the one that gets grabbed.
So I always like to ask the people that interview me. I mean, Greg, you have a pretty good handle on the topic. You've read some of the books. You've watched the movies. What are your feelings about what's happening?
Well, early on, I used to think that maybe it was Bigfoot. But I struggle with why there isn't blood or panicked screaming in these cases. I've also considered the portal idea, thinking that maybe these are ley lines or some kind of natural window areas or dimensional shifts, something like a Bermuda Triangle in the woods, because that would explain why it would be so sudden. But if it's a natural phenomenon, if it's these natural portal places, then it's like, well, why isn't there one in a city? How can they regulate them to the woods? Because nature doesn't care about where we place a national park or what lands we develop, so that's a little odd. I think maybe the best thing that has been brought up is the idea of some kind of portal technology, because there seems to be something conscious about these attacks, if we can call them that. But it happens so suddenly, it must be a technology that we don't have yet or haven't seen on the surface.
Yeah, and therein lies the conundrum of the entire 411 genre. I mean, when you really get down to it, I get asked all the time, what do I really think? And people think I'm avoiding the answer. But so far, this is a true statement, I have not ever met anybody who's read the 8 books and can tell me exactly what's happening.
Right. Now, I did see that you released some books outside of the Missing 411 series, the Hoopa Project and Tribal Bigfoot. So, I mean, you have an interest in Bigfoot, but you're not necessarily saying that these overlap.
Well, as I said, I'm a guy that's 10 miles wide and about an inch deep. And I have a lot of interests, but I've never mixed the two topics. I came out with a book about 6 months ago called Bigfoot, Wild Men, and Giants. And while I was doing the archive search on missing people, I started to come across articles about giant skeletons being found in the U.S.
Yeah.
And that intrigued me. And then in articles, I found many, many hundreds about wild men. And when you read the description of a wild man from 200 years ago, it's the same description of what we know as Bigfoot today. So I started to just cut these out and keep them, and I put them in a giant envelope, and I put them aside. And about 6 months ago, I thought, well, I've got some downtime while a new book's coming out, so I'll just go through this. It's a book that has nothing but articles in it, starting from the 1600s up until 1923. And in the mid-1900s, Bigfoot got that coined name from Jerry Crew. And so everything there forward can be construed to just be a Bigfoot Sasquatch story, and a lot of people think it's just made up. I don't think people understand that giant skeletons were found in the United States 100 years ago and further, and were given to museums and sciences because there in some of the biggest newspapers in the United States are the articles and names of people who found them and what they did with the skeletons and who they called. And then right next to those articles are articles in other stories about wild men, and that are just exactly like Bigfoot, but they just weren't in the U.S. These are stories from different parts of the world. So I put these in like tabletop-sized book, and I said, this is for the skeptic or the optimist, because it'll blow your mind when you read it.
Yes, and I'm really intrigued by wild men. I think it would make sense that there would be uncivilized people still out in the woods, possibly varieties that are giants. But in these missing 411 cases, it's like, how come these hunters can't get a shot off? How come you don't hear the screams? These are the factors that make me think it can't be a physical being, or it has to be using some kind of technology to keep people from reaching out. It almost makes me think it could be some kind of spiritual entity, which I probably didn't even put much stock in 5 years ago, but now I'm thinking that there's probably powerful non-human intelligences, possibly call them spirits. Maybe that's another one of those labels that, like Bigfoot, kind of throws people off exactly what we're dealing with out there. But Native Americans thought there were land spirits, and they definitely tried to honor them because they were kind of fearful of what these things might do. And maybe that's something that could take people in this kind of manner.
I'm not going to say no. I mean, I think everything is open at this point, and until somebody can come up with a theory that kind of encompasses all, I'm open to listening to whatever people might think. But I would encourage people to read the books, go to a library, check them out before you start coming at me with your theories, because it kind of gets tiring when people just hear a podcast or something and think, oh, I have the answer. It's a much deeper topic than most people think. And until you understand the profile points, the various areas that people have disappeared, and how I kind of go through and I talk about the different theories that people have and why they can't be true, as I would with you, it's a waste of your time and my time to write something like that up.
Yes, I can only imagine. And I'm sure you've heard every speculation just dozens and dozens of times at this point. And as we're in kind of the home stretch here, I wanted to talk about just 2 more cases, I guess, from the air section, because almost all the cases in the Missing 411 series, except for the Sobering Coincidence book and some areas of water, most of them at least are associated with land and national parks and wooded areas. But you do have a couple interesting aerial disappearances, or disappearances that do involve airplanes. And this one of Klaus Martens and Elizabeth Walker was curious because it is a rare case of 2 missing people, but their story is quite a mystery too, isn't it?
Absolutely is. So Klaus Martens was 27 years old, Elizabeth Walker 23. They were missing July 15th, 1951. And the profile points on this case was weather, tracks, and German heritage. Klaus was a 27-year-old former intelligence officer, and he had logged over 4,000 hours of flight time. Born in Germany to German parents, came to the U.S. at a young age and was adopted. At the time he disappeared, he was a car salesman in Pasadena. Elizabeth was attending nursing school in Pasadena, and they'd been dating for some time. Well, on the 15th of July, Klaus had said, let's take a flight. So he rented a Cessna that he had flown many times before, and he filed a flight plan to Blythe, California. And the plan called for them to be back that night in Pasadena. Well, when they didn't return, the parents filed a missing persons report. The Civil Air Patrol focused on an area halfway between Blythe and Pasadena over Joshua Tree National Park, which is interesting because it's a location where I've written about other disappearances of missing people. And there were multiple flight operations, and the search was about to be terminated when something weird happened. And that is that the Arizona Fish and Game Commissioner, a guy named Ace Kempton, just happened to be hiking through the Tule Desert region of his state, about 50 miles southeast of Yuma and about 10 miles northwest of Oregon Pipes National Monument, when he walked up to a Cessna airplane stopped on the ground. Now, we're not talking about an airport ground. We're talking about ground. And he said it appeared to be in working condition. Called for assistance, ran the airplane's flight number, and found it was missing from California. The location it was found was 120 miles off course and 50% further than the flight plan intended it to be. So I asked the question, is it reasonable to assume a veteran war pilot with 4,000 hours of flight time could be that far off course in perfect weather? Now, the SAR centered on the same resources and centered on the area where the plane was found. They were now 16 days behind when the couple disappeared, and 25 aircraft were looking for the pair. Well, they started to look on ground where they found the plane, and they followed some tracks for 10 miles. Now, Sheriff Washam from Arizona described what he saw in the tracks. Here's the quote from the newspaper. Their footprints abruptly disappeared for no explained reason. End of quotes. The SAR was then stopped for several days because of rain. Yes, rain in the middle of the desert in the middle of July. The area, there was no ground cover, there was no place to hide, and it was very desolate. The disappearances made headlines for about a year. Neither was ever located, and the case was closed. It's an incident, Greg, that you won't read about in other books and stories, but it's something that is very odd.
Great breakdown. And it's important to emphasize Klaus's experience with aircrafts. Also, as you say, Joshua Tree, strange area. People go missing. It has a history of UFO activity with the George Van Tassel situation. And people like to go out there and take psychedelics for a reason. It is a somewhat mystical place. You do get a vibe there, which is also something that people note throughout the Hunted film, is they say, this is an odd place. You get a strange feeling here. There's a sense of mystery in the air. It's like we do have some sixth sense about this stuff sometimes, but yet we don't stay away.
No, and like you said earlier, I haven't written about air disappearances, and I guess you could say this was a land-based disappearance if you believe that they were on the ground and walking. But it was kind of a broaching of the topic of missing airplanes, etc. And I did that because I thought that there was this overlap, especially in specific areas. So in Missing 411 Law, LAW, I called it Land, Air, and Water. That was my latest book on Missing 411. I talked about these air disappearances.
And that's a great setup, because I did have the Klaus case there, because it is so odd and it does involve an airplane. But as you say, the footprints disappear, the trail disappears on the ground. But then there's this one other case, this Frederick Valentich case, and it is sort of a classic UFO encounter in a lot of ways. But you have the full transcript in the book, his communications with the air traffic controllers, and it is really impressive. But tell us a little bit about Frederick's disappearance.
So Australia is one of those cluster zones of missing people that I've written about in my books. And I actually went to Australia, did a book tour. And if you go to our YouTube site, which is Can-Am Missing Project on YouTube, that's the only YouTube site I have. All the rest with my name, David Paulides, Missing 411, those are all hoaxes and frauds. Don't believe them. That's the only site that's ours. And in that, we actually did several YouTube cases of incidents where people disappeared. But in Frederick's case, he was 20 years old, missing October 21st, 78, in the Bass Strait of Australia. Now, Frederick is born in Melbourne, June 9th, 1958, 4 kids in his family. He always had an interest in flying. He attended a private college, took flying lessons. He's granted his student's license on February 24th, 77, his pilot's license in September of 78, and he was studying to get a commercial license. He joined the Air Training Corps, essentially a group of like-minded pilots that were young. On October 21st, 78, he'd accumulated 150 flight hours. He drove to Moorabbin Airport, rented a Cessna 182L, something he had flown many times, and he filed a flight plan to travel to King Island on the Bass Strait by way of Cape Otway. People who don't know, the Bass Strait has history, kind of like the Bermuda Triangle, of having a lot of strange disappearances. Some people thought he was first picking up passengers, then thought he was picking up crayfish. Well, he left Moorabbin at about 6:06, cruising at 160 miles per hour. He went east over Melbourne and on to Cape Otway, then over the Bass Strait directly for King Island, right on path. At 7:06 p.m., he contacted Melbourne Flight Services Officer Steve Roby, and he started talking about something in the sky. This conversation lasted 6 minutes. Now, what Frederick described is something flying above him, and he described it in detail. And he said, the flight services people said, what type of aircraft is it? And he came back and he said, Delta Sierra Juliet, I cannot affirm. It is far too bright. It seems like it has landing lights on me. And then he went on